sand ducks fly by, I love to hunt the moose that roam. Stalk the caribou on Cashin's bog in this place that I call home. The smelt that swim up Gambo Brook make a delicious meal in fall. When it comes to country living, good old Gambo's got it all.
A glacier, maybe as much as a kilometer high, had advanced and receded. It had gouged and scraped out the Gambo River Valley and Freshwater Bay, depositing thousands of boulders of various sizes onto the bed of the Gambo River. The glaciers, as they receded, left three major watersheds: Middle Brook, Traverse Brook, Gambo River, spewing fresh water into Freshwater Bay, hence the name Freshwater Bay. As this area gradually grew warmer, grass covered the earth, trees sprouted and grew ever larger. Salmon and trout moved into the bay and up the three rivers, and animals and birds populated the land and the water. All these resources were needed by man to survive: water to drink, food to eat, wood for fire and shelter, and animal skins for clothing. So man came to Freshwater Bay for all these resources. Archaeological records of skeletal remains prove that the Beothuk were living and hunting in the Gambo Pond area probably as long as 1,000 years ago. Archaeologists and historians, from their study of the ancient Norse sagas, believe that it is possible that the Norse who colonized Lanza Meadows might have visited Freshwater Bay and Gambo Pond area sometime between the year 1005 AD and 1200 AD. Early Portuguese explorers must also have come into Freshwater Bay to the Gambo River sometime in the 1500s, because the name Gambo originates from the Portuguese phrase Belagacema, which translates into English as the Bay of the Does. In the early 1720s, George Skivington from Bonavista, with a crew of men and boys, came into Freshwater Bay to fish for salmon. He had a license to take whatever salmon he could from the Gambo River, the Middle Brook River, and Traverse Brook. It is estimated that in the 1720s, Skivington and his crew of men and boys were netting and packing 700 tierces of salmon in a season that ran from June to August. 700 tierces of salmon is about 113,000 kilograms of salmon. Consider this: 113,000 kilograms of salmon is approximately 35,000 salmon. The Mi'kmaq were the first permanent settlers in Freshwater Bay. According to local historian Alan Saunders, a family of Joes and another of Mitchells settled onto Mitchell's Point sometime around 1780. Later, they moved and settled on a reserve that stretched from the north bank of the Middlebrook River to present-day Stevens Road. The first white settlers, the Europeans, in Freshwater Bay were the Pritchetts and the Filthams, who settled on Dolomon's Point around 1834. The Pritchetts and Filthams were joined by the Enders, Barrys, and Barrows, all who built houses on Dolomon's Point and in adjoining Clay Cove. James Pritchett and his wife Susanna Honeybun had the exclusive right to net all the salmon migrating into Travers Brook, Middlebrook, and the Gambo River. All the families living on Dolomon's Point and in Clay Cove made a living by salmon fishing and by logging the massive pine and the spruce and fir in the area. The Pritchetts built a sawmill on Travers Brook to saw staves to make their salmon tierces and for lumber for their homes, sheds, wharfs, and boats. This would have been the first sawmill built in Freshwater Bay. The third wave of permanent settlers came in between 1862 and 1864. David Smallwood, a merchant at Greenspond at that time, built a sawmill on Mint Brook in 1862. When that mill burned, he built a new mill, this time a steam-powered sawmill on Dominion Point. The fourth wave of settlers was the Golings, who moved in around 1871 into Hay Cove and built there a water-wheeled sawmill at the mouth of Hay Cove Brook. Just 5 years later, in 1876, John Murphy, then a merchant at Greenspond, moved into Mint Brook and built there the first of 3 mills. A community grew up around these mills and was called Mint Brook.
The census of 1874 reports that on Dolomon's Point there were 30 people, all Church of England, 1 fishing room, 4 houses for 4 families. By 1884, on Dolomon's Point were 41 people, in Middlebrook 29, Hay Cove 31, Dark Cove 31, Gambo 79, Mint Brook 39. In total there were 250 people in 6 communities. In 1911, the population of Middlebrook was 281, Dark Cove 212, Gambo 344, Mint Brook just 10. Murphy's Mill in Mint Brook had burned down in 1907, and by 1911 all but 10 people had resettled, mostly to Gambo.
The building of the railway through the Gambo area produced jobs, first in the building and then in the maintenance of the rail line. And there were jobs for local people in the ticket office, the freight shed, and aboard the trains. So, with the railway through town, in 1893, John Murphy built his large hotel to accommodate train passengers and tourists. And this hotel employed many workers, from bartenders to chambermaids, from telegraph operators to postal workers. So, by 1893, there were at least 6 sawmills, Murphy's, Pritchett's, Golings, Saunders, turning out as much lumber as they could to supply a market that took everything they could saw. These mills employed loggers and drivers and sawyers. And they needed businesses to supply their needs in food, clothing, shelter. From 1893 on through to the First World War and into the late 1920s, the three communities of Middlebrook, Dark Cove, and Gambo, because of the railway and the sawmills and the businesses needed to service them, grew in population and in prosperity. Churches and schools were built, and education became a priority for the churches and the community generally. And then the dreadful happened, the Great Depression. Banks collapsed. The Newfoundland government went heavily into debt. The markets for lumber grew smaller, and many people suffered from hunger, a lack of warm clothes, and proper shelter. Luckily, some sawmills were able to remain open, providing vital wages to loggers and drivers and sawyers who otherwise, with their large families, would have gone hungry. And then a godsend. The Anglo-Newfoundland Development Company, always known as the A&D, after the Second World War, set up a woods operation on the Gambo River watershed to supply pulpwood for its large mill at Grand Falls. This massive woods operation provided hundreds of jobs, not only to loggers and drivers, to dam builders and carpenters, to cooks and cookies, but also to firefighters and to road builders. And then, as tractors replaced horses as the draggers of wood, tractor and truck operators were hired.
And then came Confederation and further prosperity. Road building, both through the communities of Gambo, Dark Cove, and Middlebrook, and the construction of the highway from Gambo to Gander, provided all kinds of construction jobs for workers and added further to the growth of the area. By 1962, the three communities with a population of 1,900 or so was, by Newfoundland standards, a sizable community. However, it was still three separate communities. It had no formal municipal government. The communities were serviced by electricity, but it had no garbage collection and, more significantly, no water and sewage services. To get water and sewage services, the towns would have to enter into some kind of formal municipal government to raise large amounts of money needed to install this service. Then, in January 1964, the communities of Middlebrook and Dark Cove amalgamated under the name Riverwood. The name Riverwood did not catch on. But then in 1980, all three communities, which were until then a rural district, incorporated as a town under the name Gambo. That name did stick. The amalgamation and incorporation of the three communities as one town could not, however, prevent the closure of the A&D Woods operation in the early 1970s, brought on by the massive destruction of the timber resources by the Great Fire of 1961. More bad economic news came in the late 1960s, when the passenger rail service ceased operations. The railway continued to cut back its operations, and in 1988 the railway closed down completely, and the ripping up of the tracks began. Despite these economic blows and a reduction in population, the Town Council and the Smallwood Area Development Corporation have worked hard to help create jobs and promote economic activity using the town's history and heritage to increase tourism to the area and its infrastructure to provide job opportunities for its citizens.
The history of Gambo is a very interesting story of people and the events they created. Its heritage is the tangible remains of those people and their events. These tangible remains are all around us. on the 50th anniversary of the beginning of municipal government in Gambo, and during this Heritage Day, we should be especially appreciative of our proud heritage.
I've traveled all around the world from England to Japan. I've seen the 7 wonders, I've challenged no man's land. From the Colorado canyons to the California coast, but I always want to get back to the place